morning. Welcome to another sermon from the Gardner Lane Church of Christ. Today I'd like to talk with you for just a few moments on the subject of the infamous 30 pieces of silver. Our text today will be taken from Matthew, the 26th chapter. When we think of that, we think of different ways of dealing with the crucifixion of Jesus Christ from the standpoint of sermonizing. And you can look at this from different angles. Certainly you can look at the crucifixion of Christ as we look at the ugliness of sin, or it might be the fact of Jesus' selflessness. But today we want to look at this from a different angle than maybe we have looked at it before in our lives. And we want to look at this from the standpoint of lessons learned from those who held the 30 pieces of silver. When we look at this today, one of the first things we want to look at is what is their worth. One of the things we see in Exodus chapter 32 or chapter 21 verse 32 is that it comes from the standpoint of a slave that gets gored by maybe a bull, and the cost there is 30 pieces of silver. It's also the equivalent of about 4 months' wages for the average common laborer who works for a denarii or two every day. But we see here in Matthew chapter 26, and in verses 14 through 16, Matthew 26, and in verses 14 through 16, it says, and one of the 12 named Judas Iscariot went to the chief priest and said, "What are you willing to give me to betray him to you?" And they weighed out 30 pieces of silver to him. And from then he began looking for a good opportunity to betray Jesus. So we see certainly this is the price of treachery. Also, one of the questions we want to look at this morning, two questions are going to be involved this morning. This is the first of how powerful they are, the infamous 30 pieces of silver. When we look at this, we see first of all, it's powerful enough to bring Judas into league with ungodly men. In John and in chapter 1, and in verse 14, John chapter 1, verse 14, it says, "The Word became flesh and dwelt among us, that being John and the rest of the apostles. And we, that being John and the rest of the apostles, saw his glory, glory as the only begotten from the Father, full of grace and truth." We saw the glorious manifestation of his presence, and whatever John saw, Judas saw. In fact, we see over in John, the 20th chapter, and in verses 30 and 31, John chapter 20, and in verses 30 and 31, it says, "Therefore many other signs Jesus also performed in the presence of the disciples, which are not written in this book. But these have been written so that you may believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and that believing you might have life in his name." Again, what John saw, Judas was able to see as well. But how could he ignore all that he had seen? How could he ignore all the sermons that Jesus had preached and what he had heard? In 1 Timothy and in chapter 6 and in verse 10, 1 Timothy chapter 6 and in verse 10, it states there in verse 10, "For the love of money is the root of all sorts of evil, and some have looking to it have wandered away from the faith and pierced themselves with many griefs." The draw of money. The draw of money, ladies and gentlemen, still can pull us in all sorts of directions. It's powerful enough to help Judas ignore Jesus' warning. In Matthew, the 26th chapter, And in verses 20 through 25, Matthew 26, and in verse 20 through 25 it says, "Now when evening came, Jesus was reclining at the table with the 12 disciples. And as they were eating, he said, 'Truly, I say to you that one of you is going to betray me.'" One of you is going to betray me. Now what kind of mood would that set for the rest of the evening? Being deeply grieved, they each one began saying to him, "Surely not I, Lord." And he answered, "He who dipped his hand with me in the bowl is the one who will betray me, and the Son of Man is to go just as it is written of him, but woe to that man by whom the Son of Man is betrayed. It would be good for him that he had not been born." And Judas, who was betraying him, there you go, he's in the process of betraying him, said, "Surely not I, Rabbi." And Jesus said to him, See to that yourself." In John and in chapter 13, and in verses 26 and 27, John 13, and in verse 26 and 27, he says in verse 26, "And he answered, This is the one for whom I shall dip the morsel and give it to him. And when he had dipped the morsel, he took and he gave it to Judas, the son of Simon Iscariot. After the morsel, Satan then entered to him. Therefore Jesus said unto him, What you do quickly." In chapter 12 of John, and in verse 6, it says, "Now concerning this, not because he had been concerned about the poor, but because he was a thief, and he had the money box, and he used to pilfer what was put into it." In Matthew chapter 26 and in verse 14, it says that one of the 12, Judas Iscariot, went to the chief priest, and he said, "What are you willing to give me to betray him to you?" We could be as guilty today in ignoring the Scripture's warnings about money. In Ecclesiastes and in chapter 2 and in verse 18, Ecclesiastes 2 and in verse 18, he says in verse 18, "Thus I hated all the fruit of my labor, for which I had labored under the sun, for I must leave it to the man who will come after me." You don't know. You don't know what that person is going to do with it, what your spouse is going to do, what your children are going to do with it, or anybody else that might act in a foolish way. How powerful were they? Powerful enough for him to betray innocent blood. Deuteronomy 27 verse 25. Matthew chapter 27 verse 4. Money can lead us into doing the unthinkable, that which we would not ordinarily do. In Luke and in chapter 15, concerning that of the prodigal son, and in verse 13 through 15, it says in verse 13, "And after many days the younger son gathered everything together, went on a journey into a distant country, and there he squandered his estate with loose living. And when he had spent everything, a severe famine occurred in that country, and he began to be impoverished. And he went and he hired himself out to one of the citizens of that country, and he sent him into the field to feed the swine." He was doing something to a Jew that would be unthinkable. But that's what money will cause you to do. The second question is, how deceitful were they? And such deceit is where riches have their power. We see this in the parable of the sower in Matthew chapter 13 and in verse 22. Matthew 13 and in verse 22. It says in one of them, on whom the seed was sown among the thorns, this man hears the word, and the worry of the world and the deceitfulness of riches or wealth choke the word, and it becomes unfruitful. Also deceitful enough that they couldn't buy back what Judas had sold. He had sold the Lord for 30 pieces of silver, but he also sold himself. How deceitful were they? Deceitful enough that they couldn't silence Judas's conscience. In chapter 27 of Matthew, and in verse 2, then in verse 3, then in verse 5, Matthew 27, verse 3, then verse 5, it says, then when Judas, who betrayed him, saw that he had been condemned, he felt remorse and returned the 30 pieces of silver to the chief priests and elders, saying, I have sinned by betraying innocent blood. And they said, what is that to us? See to that yourself. And he threw the pieces of silver into the temple sanctuary and departed. And he went away and he hanged himself. But there's no guarantee that a turned off conscience will remain that way. We see that with Peter, to where he went out and he wept bitterly. I guess he could have went out and hung himself as well, but he chose to repent of his sins. In Romans, and in chapter 2, and in verse 14, Romans chapter 2, and in verse 14, it says, for when the Gentiles who do not have the law, do instinctively the things of the law, these not having the law are a law to themselves. Well, they didn't have the law. But at the same time, they knew it was wrong to murder. They knew it was wrong to steal. They knew it was wrong to take someone else's wife. Those are things instinctively that people know. Well, Judas attempts to return. Isn't the end of the sad story. Ironically, in the end, the 30 pieces of silver were unwanted by all. The chief priests, they didn't want the 30 pieces of silver because that would be blood money. Judas threw it into the temple. He didn't want the 30 pieces of silver anymore. The point is, the materialism is deceptive and worthless in reality. Money can be a tremendous blessing for good, or it can be a hellish burden if misused. These pieces of money show us two things. One, just how far one can be led astray by the glitter that money promises. And the other, just how immaterial materialism really is when compared with saving truth. Well, we appreciate you listening in this morning. We invite you to listen in again next week to another edition. Until next week, we bid you a very pleasant good day.